This is the third lecture that I'm giving in the course Geography 212, Mobilities in the Contemporary World. Up until now, we've been focusing on really longer-term mobilities, geographies of migration and diaspora. This is something quite different, but it's still focusing very much on Africa and African cities in this case. So what we want to do is change the scale now and really look at everyday mobilities. These are short-term mobilities. This is about the journey to work. And as you can see from the slide, this is Lagos, Nigeria. This is not always something very easy in an African city. I'm going to be quoting from a report which was done by two consultants called Kumar and Barrett in 2008, and it was entitled, very appropriately, Stuck in Traffic, Urban Transport in Africa. And in this report they did intensive research on 14 major African cities, none of them in South Africa, and came up with some interesting conclusions. And the whole report I've uploaded onto a Canva. You can either just read the executive summary, you can do that, but then you can page through and see some of the detail. So what they say, getting to work is increasingly difficult in Africa's sprawling commercial capitals, in large part because of the tidal wave of minibuses and motorcycles that have arrived to take the place of faltering public bus services. The reasons behind the dysfunctional state of urban transport are not difficult to discern. Weak, fragmented, and underfunded authorities have been unable to maintain existing services, or to plan for expansion. Buses fall apart after running overloaded for years on rutted roads. Replacements are soon idled for lack of parts. Fares are too low, subsidies too irregular to permit sustainable operations. Commuters walk or resort to largely unregulated and informal services that are dirty, unsafe, uncomfortable, and unreliable. Everybody loses. So let's have a look at this in more detail. I'll go to the next slide. How did this come about? And here I think we need to look at a brief history. Because when many of these African states became independent, a lot of them had publicly run, publicly owned public transport systems, and these were largely, big bus companies, a large bus, companies running these large buses. But what happened was, immediately after colonialism ended, at first they could carry on. They were able to operate without a subsidy, but it turned out that this was unsustainable. And why? Because the public funding dried up. Okay, and if you didn't have public funding, the buses couldn't be replaced. You had the quality of service that they could offer deteriorating. And what happened was that most state-run bus companies actually went bankrupt. They failed. And all this has to be seen against the backdrop of the financial squeeze that was exerted on many African countries, especially in the 70s and 80s. This was an era that we call the era of structural adjustment, when the West was imposing a number of regulations on African countries to try and restructure their economies. I won't go into structural adjustment in any detail. And of course, there was never a well-developed public transport system anyway, because you're still dealing with the legacies of colonial development, there was never an intention for large numbers of poor people to be able to be conveyed around African cities. So in this study by Kumar and Barrett, they found that actually of all the cities that they looked at, 14. So at the same time as this has happened, You've had an enormous growth of urban populations in African cities. More and more people are now trying to make a living in cities. This is especially from the 90s, but it's a trend that's continuing. And really what's happened is that the resources of most African states have been simply overwhelmed by the numbers of people that they're supposed to be providing for in terms of public transport. So how on earth are people to move around the city? In this picture you can see a lot of people walking, but you can also see that there are vehicles on the road, and some of these vehicles are minibus taxis. And some people refer to this as the minibus revolution. So we've spoken about why it's happened. The failure of the state, the public transport systems after government subsidies were removed. Really what's happened is the public sector has abdicated its responsibility. You'll see this phrase, abdication of responsibility. The state has abdicated or stepped away from, or said it won't fulfill or can't fulfill this responsibility. So clearly then there's a gap in the market. People need to move around the city. And what's happened in African cities is that this gap in the market has been filled by private entrepreneurs. These are private operators who are now moving in to fill the gap left by the state. So what does the state do? The state can't do much except try, to regulate them, which is easier said than done. As I said before, some cities in Africa have abandoned large bus service altogether and now rely exclusively on private, largely informal minibus services. These are cities like Accra, Dar es Salaam, Kampala, Kigali, and Lagos. And I'd like to ask you if you know which country each of those big cities is located in. If not, go to your map. Nairobi, Kenya, is the only city in the study not to have passed through this cycle, because they've retained the private operation of the large bus service since independence. So they still have a large bus service. Even though it's been privatized, there's still large buses, and in South Africa, of course, we have that still. We have large bus service. But in other African cities, the only option is minibus taxi. And what are these kinds of forms of transport called? Well, the technical word for it is paratransit. Para, you've probably heard of parastatals. It's something that operates in adjunct to the state, but it's not part of the state. So if we're talking about paratransit in the Northern Hemisphere, you might be talking about, the provision of extra transport, perhaps for disabled people, something like that. But in the African context, paratransit doesn't just run alongside state-provided transport. It actually dominates the whole scene because there is no state-provided transport. So the way that this is described by authors, this is a nice quote here. Public transport systems in contemporary sub-Saharan African cities are heavily reliant upon paratransit services. How do we define them? We can define them as informal transportation, which operates in between the public and the individual private spheres. Okay, so it's not the state providing the bus. In Cape Town, we have the Bus for Us. That's provided by the state, Golden Arrow. Although it might be a bit privatized. Okay, and then you have the commuter who drives in their own personal car to work. But in between those two is this whole field of paratransit, where a private entrepreneur owns the vehicle and uses that vehicle to offer people transport to work. That's paratransit. So the minibus has really taken over African cities. And there's a whole geography of the minibus, which would be fascinating to look at. In different countries, the minibuses have different names. And of course, they are different sizes. You can get bigger ones or smaller ones. The ones we know are, the 8 to 25 passengers. But of course, they're often overloaded. In South Africa, we just call them rather unimaginatively minibus taxis. In Nairobi, they're called matatus. In Lagos, Nigeria, sorry, there's a spelling mistake there, Lagos, they're called Danfo. And the picture at the bottom of the slide is a matatu in Kenya. They're often quite brightly decorated. They're usually yellow in color. For those interested in pursuing this further, there's a new book that's just come out in 2015, which has got kind of the state-of-the-art discussions of paratransit in African cities. And in fact, that's the title of the book, Paratransit in African Cities. And the subtitle is Operations, Regulation and Reform. Edited by Behrens, McCormick, and Mfananga. Published by Routledge, which is a big international publisher. So this is obviously a very important book to get if one really wants to understand, the most recent research on paratransit in African cities. I'm sure the picture at the bottom right will be familiar to many people, that experience of sitting, in a minibus taxi being taken somewhere by the driver. This is not the state providing you with transport. It's a private operator providing you with transport. So in the blurb for the book, the advertisement of the book, they say, in Africa, paratransit is characterized by low-quality vehicles and chaotic management. And then I've put this next bit in red. At the same time, it also provides cheap, accessible, and flexible transport solutions for the urban poor. Paratransit is typically poorly regulated. It operates as a set of informal businesses. And it's characterized by a couple of things. It's characterized by weak regulation. So the state finds it difficult to regulate this industry. And the other problematic thing about it is, this is in technical terms, there's a strategy of getting fares from the passengers, which is very different to proper public transport provided by the state, because here the owners are claiming a fixed daily revenue target. They're trying to earn X amount from their vehicle on a daily basis. And then the drivers can keep the variable balance as income. So the drivers have to give a set amount per day to the owner of the vehicle, and then anything left over, the driver can keep. So what does that incentivize? If you were working for a transit company in a developed country, you would be getting a salary at the end of the month. So it really wouldn't matter whether there are enough people in the taxi. If you only had 3 people and it was time to go, you would go. It wouldn't be a taxi, it would be a bus. The bus moves forward and goes to the next stop. It's not based on the number of people the number of fares who get in at that stop. So it's heavily subsidized by the state. The whole incentive structure here is different. With paratransit, it's about the individual owner and the individual driver trying to make as much money as possible for themselves. So can you see how that incentive would create a whole range of consequences? First of all, it's going to create a temptation to speed, to get to your destination as quickly as possible and get back and pick up more passengers. I also know that people tell me that the taxi will wait and wait and wait until it's full and overfull and bursting before it moves. And you can wait an hour or two until the taxi fills up before you get to leave. So there's no set schedule. So this is problematic. Clearly, it might result in a lot of discomfort for the traveler, the person who is taking this form of transit. Okay, and so a lot of the literature actually debates this. What are the good things and what are the bad things about the minibus taxi? There are some advantages, because this does at least allow poor people, not just poor people actually, but everybody to move around the city in the absence of other options. The other thing is that minibuses are quite agile if you compare them with the large buses. The large buses, there are places where they can't go. The minibus can get to places where the large buses can't go, especially if there's poor road quality. You could see the flexibility of the minibus as an advantage. As you know, minibus taxi, if it sees a passenger, the driver sees a potential fare, standing by the road, signaling, the minibus taxi will just swerve in front of whoever is driving and stop to pick up that passenger. You can hail a minibus and hop on anywhere. You don't, whereas with a formal bus service, you would have set time and routes. Of course, it's very irritating to other drivers on the road when that happens, but we all kind of expect that now from minibus taxi drivers, that they can pull in and pull up to let in a passenger at anywhere, which is an advantage for passengers. Possibly affordability. Probably most people would think of a minibus taxi as an affordable option, and maybe more affordable than getting a bus pass, although we in South Africa are very lucky to have the option of a formal bus as well, or even in Cape Town a train, with all the problems that has, of course. So the minibuses can keep fares low because they're on a profit principle, whereas a public bus company cannot work unless it gets a huge subsidy from the state. So those are some of the advantages. But I'm afraid we have to think also about the disadvantages. And the first one is the lack of state regulation, or the difficulty in regulating this industry. So if you're regulating something, you're then controlling it and bringing in controls which, of course, the operators might not like. In most African countries, the vehicle owners tend to be businessmen, government officials, or professionals for whom involvement in public transport provides a way to supplement income without incurring much, if any, tax liabilities. They're not paying tax on this money generally, and they're the owners of these vehicles, not the drivers. So how are you going to regulate that? There is regulation, but it's usually self-regulation. So the drivers themselves form unions or syndicates. You have to get approval. You can't just suddenly become a driver. You have to see who is operating on this route. Excuse me, who is operating on this route, and to probably pay to buy in to become a driver on the same route. And we've seen this in South Africa. It's much better now, but certainly a decade or so ago, or 2 decades ago, when this was really taking off. And it happens today. You get competition for the control of lucrative routes, and you get what are known as taxi killings, where rival taxi drivers shoot each other because they're competing for routes. So that's very dangerous for passengers. They get caught up in the crossfire of these gangs. Gosh, and one can go on and on about the disadvantages in a way. Sure, you might have the flexibility, but at the same time you have unpredictability. So you never quite know when a taxi is going to come along. Whereas in a more formal system, you would have a specific timetable and a route, and you would know this bus is going to be arriving at this bus stop at 2:15. With a taxi, you have to stand there and wait until one comes along. Often there's poor maintenance. You'll see in a roadblock, the first vehicles that are pulled aside are always the taxis. And I'm sure many of you have driven in taxis and been passengers in taxis where you felt like this vehicle's not been well maintained, which then leads to safety concerns. A lot of accidents, high proportion of accidents. And then in many African countries, the owners don't really have insurance. So if you're injured, you've got a problem because you can't really make a claim. We know about speeding because of the incentive for the drivers to go as fast as they can. Often disregarding the passengers' pleas to slow down. Discomfort, uncomfortable mobility. Any of you who've been in an overcrowded taxi will know how this feels. Students have told me about the experience of the taxi being full, but then them being put into this tiny little space, which apparently is called a laptop, and having to sit on this very uncomfortable little laptop. It's not even a proper seat. And of course, you'll often find, people encroaching into your private space. Very loud music often, which some people like, but others might not like. So it can be very uncomfortable, and you can just be dying, waiting for this to end, to get to your destination. In some of the countries, there's so many of these taxis on the road, minibuses, that it's creating a major pollution problem with emissions from the taxi exhausts, really adding to the urban pollution problems and road congestion, such as the slide that I began this presentation with. Basically, nothing is moving. So that's one of the minibus taxis in Lagos. They're called Danfos there. I've been searching the internet for some personal accounts of what it feels like in different parts of Africa to ride on a minibus taxi, and I've uploaded a couple of those. What I'd like you to do is to write down your own personal account of traveling in a minibus taxi in Cape Town, and to tell me about your worst experience. You can tell me about your best experience as well. Are there any positives? But I would like to know what it was like, and whether you've had a bad experience. What was your worst experience of riding, being a passenger in a minibus taxi in Cape Town? And then the other thing to think about, which I'd like you to think about, Have you heard of the Amapela? Now the word Amapela means cockroach. So there are vehicles which operate in the Cape Town, townships and around called Amapela. And why do you think they're called Amapela? Do you consider those vehicles as public transit? Because they're not minibus taxis as such. They're privately owned sedan cars, which people then, use as taxis, and they take you further than the taxi rank. They take you into the township. So what do you think? Do you think this is also paratransit? And why do you think they're called Amapela? And I'm hoping that we'll be able to see each other this week, depending on events on campus. But in the meantime, have a look at some of the material that I'm posting on the Akamva page, and write a paragraph. I'm not talking about a whole essay, literally just a paragraph, your own personal account of traveling in a minibus taxi. It doesn't have to be in Cape Town, maybe it was in Joburg or somewhere else, but your worst experience, and maybe some good experiences as well if you've had some good experiences, and please bring that to the next lecture.